I want you to think back to the time where you had the best customer service experience of your life. Maybe it was at a hotel where they just treated you well. They met every need you had. Maybe it was at a restaurant where the server was just amazing. They saw what you needed. They saw your water glass or whatever it was in need, and they served you immediately right then. They were polite. They were kind. You know, customer service is great, and we love to rave about it. We give them 5 stars on Yelp or whatever. But, sometimes it's hard to express gratitude when the service is subpar. It's not great. Sometimes we get a little upset or antsy. We just don't like it when the service isn't good. Service is a challenge. It's a challenge for those who are rendering it, and it's a challenge sometimes for us to even receive it. Well, today we're going to talk about service and how service takes place in our everyday life. You see, Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. In Mark chapter 10, verse 32, Jesus and his disciples are on the road to Jerusalem. Jesus set his face toward the cross, and they're going down for Passover. And Jesus is going to teach them about service. This passage is part of a larger passage that's all about discipleship and what it means to follow Jesus. And Jesus is going to teach them here about serving others and how he's going to serve them. And he's going to turn their expectations upside down. So let's look at Mark chapter 10, verse 32. They were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. The disciples were astonished, but those who followed him were afraid. Taking the 12 aside again, he began to tell them the things that would happen to him. See, we are going up to Jerusalem. The Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death. They will hand him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him, spit on him, flog him, and kill him. And he will rise after 3 days. Now it appears there are 2 groups headed toward Jerusalem. We have Jesus and the disciples, and there's this other group. They could have been people just going in the same direction, but it's probably more likely they were a group of people following along with Jesus and the disciples. You see, it says the disciples were astonished as Jesus walked toward Jerusalem ahead of them. He says the people with them were afraid as Jesus walked toward Jerusalem ahead of them. You see, I think they were probably afraid because Jesus was going into the lion's den. He's going into the place where the people who opposed him were the strongest. And they were astonished and they were afraid. Astonished of his courage and afraid maybe for his life and maybe even theirs. But Jesus takes the disciples aside and he begins to teach them again about what it means for him to go to Jerusalem, for him to suffer. Look back at the passage. What do we see? What's going to happen to Jesus? Well, he's going to be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes. They're going to hand him over to the Gentiles. They're going to condemn him to death. People are going to mock him, spit on him, flog him, kill him. And after 3 days, he's going to rise again. This is the 3rd time Jesus taught about his coming death. He does it in Mark 8 and Mark 9 as well. And Jesus here, though, he adds a few more details. He adds the details of his torture that's going to be taking place. And I want us to stop for a moment. I want you to, again, think about these disciples. They're astonished that he's going. But how did these additional things like dealing with torture and things like that, how do you think that affected them? And why do you think it's necessary for Jesus to continually remind his disciples about his death and resurrection? Jesus repeatedly and with ever-increasing details explains what's coming to the disciples. Remember, he's trying to dissuade them of this notion that he's a revolutionary. They're expecting someone to overthrow the Romans, and Jesus is constantly trying to remind them that that's not what's going on. Jesus reminds them that he must suffer. If he's going to overthrow the greatest enemy that they have, which is sin, then he must suffer and die for them. So he's constantly reminding them of that. A rebel may die. A successful revolutionary may go on to lead others. But Jesus says, I'm neither one of those things. I'm a suffering servant, and I've got to die for you in your place. And they're astonished, and people are scared. But Jesus is trying to get them ready, get them prepared for what's really coming their way. So he's on his way to Jerusalem, and he stops to teach them. And then what else does he have to say to them? Look at Mark chapter 10, verse 35 through 38. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, approached him and said, Teacher, we want you to do whatever we ask you. "What do you want me to do for you?" he asked them. They answered, "Allow us to sit at your right and your left in your glory." Jesus said to them, "You don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup I drink? Are you baptized with the baptism I am baptized with?" Jesus isn't just going to teach about his suffering. He's going to teach about service, about our service and these men's service. But what do you know about these men, James and John? Well, you might remember they're the sons of Zebedee, the sons of thunder. They were fishermen. They were followers of Jesus. They might have even been Jesus' cousins. We're not really sure. Matthew, when he tells this story, tells us that their mother came and asked the question, but they were there with her. I want you to consider the question. Jesus, will you honor us? Will you give us a great honor, Jesus, in your coming kingdom? I want you to stop and I want you to consider motivations. What do you think the motivation was behind their question? In life, we often need to check our motivations. Check in on ourselves sometimes. Why are we doing what we're doing? Why are we asking what we're asking? Why are we seeking after certain things? What are our motivations? It seems these men are motivated by ambition. They thought Jesus was going to be a revolutionary, going to overthrow the government. They say, Jesus, when you overthrow these people, let us be honored. Let us sit at your right and your left. That's a picture of great honor. Jesus is going to lead. He's going to be the new king and the new ruler, and we're going to be right at his side. They have ambition on their mind. They're questioning where they're going to sit in the coming kingdom. But Jesus, he could have rebuked them. He could sit back and go, guys, you are terrible. You have the wrong motivations. But Jesus, instead of rebuking them, he's going to teach them. He's going to take a moment. He's going to give them a discipleship lesson on the cup and on baptism. Let's consider this cup. In the Old Testament, the cup could be a picture of blessing. It could be a picture of suffering. We see both of this in the Psalms. In Psalm 16, it's a cup of blessing. In Psalm 11, it's a cup of destruction. Here, Jesus clearly means the negative connotation. Jesus clearly means he is going to drink from a cup of suffering to pay for humanity's sin. But what about baptism? This idea of baptism isn't really mentioned in the Old Testament, but water sometimes has the connotation of being overcome with tragedy. In Psalm 42, the psalmist speaks of waterfalls. In Psalm 69, he talks of floodwaters threatening people. Jesus is referring to that coming surge of tragedy. It's going to roll over him like floodwaters. And he asked these guys, can you deal with that? Can you drink from the same cup? Can you experience the same tragedy I'm going to experience? You see, instead of berating them, he's guiding them. He's walking them through a discipleship process because they, just like us, are on a path of discipleship, a pathway of sanctification, where we have to learn things. He's trying to help them learn. So he asked them, can you do this too? Let's look and see how they respond. Look at Mark chapter 10, verse 39. We are able, they told him. Jesus said to them, you will drink the cup I drink, and you will be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with. But to sit at my right or left is not mine to give. Instead, it is for those for whom it has been prepared. Of course we can. We can do it, Jesus. We can suffer like you. Well, truth is they would. Jesus tells them that here. The Bible tells us in the book of Acts that James was the first apostle to be martyred. And John was sentenced to isolation and exile in the Isle of Patmos by Emperor Domitian. You see, it was coming their way. And in the end, these guys did suffer for Jesus, and I think they did so gladly because they were on a pathway. And this question and answer period right here with these messed up motives, all that's just the beginning. Jesus began walking them through the process of change. He does it with us. But this process sometimes has negative things happen along the way. You see, these guys' ambition is going to cause a rift between them and their friends. Let's look and see what happens next when the other disciples find out what's going on. Look at Mark chapter 10, verse 41. When the 10 disciples heard this, they began to be indignant with James and John. Jesus called them over and said to them, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of Gentiles lord it over them, and those in high positions act as tyrants over them, but it is not so among you. On the contrary, whoever wants to become great among you will be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you will be a slave to all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Well, when you live with and travel with a small group of people, things don't stay secret for long. The other disciples found out, and they were not pleased. They were indignant. I want you to stop for a second. You might think, oh, that's not good of them. That's not proper. Well, just stop for a second and consider, why were they indignant? But also consider, how do you feel when someone in your life requests a better seat at the table? Someone like a coworker or a family member. They want something better, and sometimes that puts you at a disadvantage. Ambition wasn't unique to the Sons of Thunder. It's not unique to your coworker. Sometimes we all struggle with ambition. The ambition that is unhealthy and puts other people down. And I think here the disciples, they were struggling. They weren't mad that James and John asked for something that was out of the blue. They were probably mad because James and John thought to ask for it first. They wanted to be at Jesus' right hand. They all wanted that. And Jesus knew they had an unhealthy ambition. And Jesus knew he needed to teach them about what it means to serve. So he's going to give them two real-life examples, two object lessons. He's going to show them what worldly leadership is like. He's going to show them what servant leadership is like. You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those in high positions act as tyrants over them. Have you ever had a leader, a boss, somebody lord their authority over you, put you in your place, make you do grunt work that they don't want to do, things that is just below them? You see, we experience that in our daily lives all the time. You know, when we're at work or we're in an organization or something like that, we experience people lording their authority in an unhealthy way over us. So sometimes authority and position, they come by way of bribery. They did in Jesus' day. They do in our day. They come by way of personal successes. They did in Jesus' day. They do in our day. They come by people pushing others aside. Same situation then as is now. You see, people in authority sometimes, in a worldly manner, will hurt others and lord their authority and their power over other people. Jesus says that's the way the world does it. That's not the way you do it. Look back at verse 43 and 44. But it's not so among you. On the contrary, whoever wants to become great among you will be your servant. Whoever wants to be first among you will be a slave to all. The word Jesus uses here for servant is the same word we get deacon from. It's to serve tables. You know, I've thought about servers. And I've done my little bit in the past serving people in catering and things like that. And, you know, a server, he gets dirty. You have to go pick up all those plates and your fingers get greasy and it's just gross because, I don't know, you pick up their water glass and there's spit on it. It's just disgusting. And servers have to do things that really are not pleasant sometimes. Jesus says you, as a servant leader, as somebody who's going to lead others in a manner of a servant, are going to have to do things that are unpleasant sometimes. You're going to get a little dirty sometimes. But Jesus takes it even further than the idea of a servant. He takes the idea of a slave. He says, you're not just going to be servants to people, you're going to be slaves to them. You're going to serve like a slave. Now, a slave does not have the right to say no. When someone says to go do something, a slave goes and does it. Now, Jesus isn't advocating for the idea of slavery. He's just picking a picture from their daily life. He says, you know how slaves are treated? That's how you need to act. So Jesus is trying to show them, he's turning their world upside down and saying, y'all, when we serve people, that is the way we're supposed to lead. When we lead people, we're supposed to lead like a servant, lead like a slave, do what needs to be done, even if you get dirty and even if you don't want to do it. So Jesus is really trying to help them understand what it means to be a leader and what it means to be a servant. I think we can get a really good picture of the way we need to act if we go to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Paul speaks of love here. He says love is patient, love is kind, love does not envy, is not boastful, is not arrogant, is not rude, is not self-seeking, is not irritable, and does not keep a record of wrongs. Love finds no joy in unrighteousness, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. That is a servant, and that is a great leader. When you can put away arrogance and self-service, and we can really love people, and in loving them, serve them, That is what it means to lead. And that's what Jesus is trying to get them to understand. Y'all, I didn't come to lord over people. And you're not to lord over people. I came to serve people. You need to serve people because Jesus is basing everything on what it means to be a true servant. What does he say? Look at verse 45. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many. This passage began with Jesus talking about his coming death and his torture. And then we get this ambition of these two disciples, and then really reflected in the other disciples. They're just ambition for more. Their ambition to get more, to be more important. And then Jesus begins to teach them, no, you're not to be the most important person in the room. You're not supposed to be the Lord over all. You're supposed to be a servant. You're supposed to be a slave to other people. And to prove it to you, I'm going to return to this idea of my death. He says, y'all remember, I'm going to die for you. My death isn't going to accomplish anything for me. It's going to accomplish great things as we are ransom for many. Jesus is trying to show them what it means to be a leader, what it means to be a servant. He's moving them forward, moving them through this process. And we've got to check our motives sometimes too. We've got to remember it's not all about us. We're not the most important thing going on. We need to serve other people, be slaves to other people, and to help them. And when we do that, we're really being the leaders God's called us to be. I want you to just take some time this week, and I want you to consider ways that you can serve other people. How can you, or how can you even your group at church, how can you serve other people? How can you serve in your church and in your community? What are some ways that you can really put people first? It's a challenge sometimes to put ourselves second and put other people's first. It's a challenge sometimes to really serve other people. But Jesus called us to do that, and we have him as our example. So how can you do that this week? How can you serve others? How can you put others first? How can you put your wants, your desires second? Challenge to do that this week. I'll see you next week.